The warning lights flashed red across the massive galactic communications hub as another desperate message crackled through the speakers. Communications Officer Hyun leaned forward in his chair, his hands moving quickly across the control panel as he tried to clean up the static-filled transmission. The voice that came through was unlike anything most humans had heard before. It sounded like wind chimes made of crystal, beautiful but terrifyingly weak. "This is Zealothi Research Station 77 Alpha," the voice whispered through the speakers. "We are under attack by Korthok raiders. Our shields are failing. We have civilians, researchers, families, children. Please, anyone who can hear this, we need immediate assistance. Our defensive systems are down. We have maybe hours left before total system collapse." Heian felt his stomach drop. He had been monitoring galactic communications for 3 years, and he knew exactly what Korthok raiders meant. They were the worst kind of space pirates, the type who didn't just steal and leave. They took prisoners, sold them as slaves, or worse. The Zealothi were known throughout the galaxy as peaceful, crystal-based lifeforms who devoted their lives to scientific research. They had no weapons, no military, nothing to defend themselves with. The transmission repeated every few minutes, but each time it came through weaker than before. Hyun could hear explosions in the background now, and the crystalline voice was starting to crack with fear and exhaustion. He immediately forwarded the distress call to every major fleet in the galaxy, hoping someone, anyone, would respond. Fleet Admiral Minho was reviewing daily reports in his office aboard the flagship when the emergency alert reached his desk. He had been expecting routine supply requests and training schedules, not a desperate plea for help from the edge of known space. As he read the initial report, his expression grew darker with each line. Within an hour, the responses started flooding in, and every single one made Minho's jaw clench tighter. The Altarian Navy, with their massive blue ships and superior technology, sent back a formal rejection citing extreme risk parameters and insufficient strategic value. The Centauri Defense Force, known for their precision and discipline, declared the mission tactically unfeasible given current resource allocation. Even the peaceful Vegan Confederation, who prided themselves on humanitarian missions, refused to send ships into what they called the Deathworld periphery. Captain Gina burst into his office without knocking, which told Minho everything he needed to know about how serious this was. Gina never forgot protocol unless lives were at stake. She was carrying a data pad with star charts and fleet positions, her usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled urgency. "Sir, you need to see this," she said, throwing the charts onto his desk. "The Kepler 442 system is right here, in our expansion zone. We have Battle Group Prometheus currently running exercises just 2 jumps away. We're literally the only ones close enough to make it in time." Minho studied the fading transmission data that Hyun had forwarded. The Zealothi colony was losing power by the hour. Their distress signal was getting weaker, which meant their communications array was failing. If their communications were going down, their life support couldn't be far behind. These weren't soldiers or warriors, they were scientists and their families, completely helpless against raiders who made a living from cruelty. "Sir, I have to be honest with you," Gina continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The other species think we're completely insane for even considering this. The Korthok raiders have superior numbers, better weapons, and they chose this system specifically because it's in what everyone calls the Deathworld periphery. They know no one will come." Minho stood up slowly, walking to the massive viewport that showed the stars stretching endlessly in all directions. He thought about Earth, about humanity's long history of facing impossible odds. He thought about all the times throughout human history when someone had to make the choice between safety and doing what was right. "They don't understand what it means to leave people behind," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of every human who had ever refused to abandon others in need. "Signal Battle Group Prometheus. Full combat loadout. Tell them we jump in 20 minutes. The alert klaxon echoed through the corridors of the heavy cruiser. Soul's hammer as Commander Sunho read the deployment order that had just appeared on his command screen. Around him, his bridge crew looked up from their stations with expressions that mixed curiosity with concern. They had been running routine patrol exercises in what most of the galaxy considered the middle of nowhere. But now they were being called into action for something much more serious. Sunho's crew were not ordinary soldiers. These were men and women who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments the human military had to offer. Many had survived the brutal Australian outback campaigns, where they had learned to fight in temperatures that could kill in minutes, and terrain that seemed designed to destroy anything human-made. Others were veterans of the Siberian conflict, where they had operated in cold so extreme that their breath would freeze before it left their mouths. These were people who had chosen to serve on ships that operated at the very edge of human space, where rescue might be months away if something went wrong. When Sunho announced their mission over the ship's communication system, the response was immediate and decisive. There was no panic, no complaints about the danger they were about to face. Instead, there was a grim determination that settled over the crew like armor. They had heard about the Korthok raiders, knew their reputation for brutality, but they also knew that somewhere out there, innocent people were dying while the rest of the galaxy watched and did nothing. 3 decks below, Lieutenant Yunji was running final diagnostics on their boarding pods in the Marine Preparation Bay. These were specialized assault craft, designed to punch through enemy ship hulls and deliver Marines directly into combat. Around her, her squad was checking their equipment with the methodical precision of soldiers who knew their lives depended on every piece of gear working perfectly. Each Marine carried weapons and armor designed for the close-quarters combat that boarding actions required, but they also carried medical supplies and emergency equipment for the civilians they hoped to save. "Listen up," Youngji called to her squad as they gathered around her. "Intelligence reports say Korthok raiders prefer plasma weaponry. It's flashy, intimidating, and causes maximum psychological damage. But here's the thing about raiders. They build their ships for intimidation, not durability. They rely on fear to win their battles, not engineering. Their hulls are designed to look scary, with lots of spikes and aggressive angles, but they're not built to take real punishment." Her Marines nodded, understanding the tactical implications. Human ships were built completely differently. They were designed by people who came from a world that tried to kill them every day. So every system had backups, every component was overbuilt, and every design choice prioritized survival over appearance. On the destroyer, Busan Lightning, Captain Jinwoo was coordinating with the other ships in their battle group through the quantum communication array. The human fleet might have been smaller than what other species would consider necessary for this type of mission, but each ship represented the absolute pinnacle of human engineering. These vessels had hulls reinforced to withstand the crushing gravity of gas giant operations, power systems that could function in the electromagnetic storms of nebulae, and life support systems designed to keep crews alive in conditions that would be instantly lethal to most galactic species as they prepared to enter hyperspace. Jinwoo looked at the tactical displays showing their destination. The Kepler 442 system was deep in what the rest of the galaxy called the Deathworld periphery, a region of space that most civilized species avoided because of its proximity to human expansion zones. The irony wasn't lost on him. The other species were so afraid of humans that they wouldn't even enter the same region of space. But now they expected humans to risk everything to save people those same species had abandoned across the galaxy. Alien observers watched in disbelief as the human fleet engaged their hyperspace drives and disappeared into the void. The Korthok raiders were known throughout civilized space for their superior firepower and complete lack of mercy. Their ships were bigger, their weapons more advanced, and their reputation for brutality was legendary. Most species considered the human response to be noble, but ultimately futile. a gesture that would only result in more deaths. In the medical bay of the Soul's Hammer, Medical Officer Soman was preparing for what she knew would be one of the most challenging missions of her career. The casualty bays were being reconfigured to handle both human and Zealothi patients, but the crystalline beings presented unique medical challenges. They required very specific atmospheric conditions to survive, with precise mixtures of gases that were actually toxic to most other life forms. Standard galactic medical equipment wasn't designed for these requirements, so Soman was improvising solutions, using industrial components that most species would never consider using in a medical setting. As the fleet entered hyperspace and began their journey toward what might be their final battle, each crew member understood that they were truly alone in this mission. No reinforcements were coming, no other species would help them, and if they failed, the galaxy would simply shrug and move on. The moment Battle Group Prometheus dropped out of hyperspace, the reality of the situation hit them like a physical blow. Sensor operator Dong Yun's hands flew across his control panel as his screens lit up with contact signatures, his voice cutting through the bridge's tense silence with clinical precision. 12 Korthok vessels confirmed, sir. They've got the research station completely surrounded. His voice remained steady, but everyone could see the way his jaw tightened as he processed what his sensors were telling him. The Zealothi research station hung in space like a dying star, its once bright, crystalline structures now flickering weakly as explosions blossomed across its surface. The station had been beautiful once, a work of art as much as science, with graceful spires that caught and refracted starlight in patterns that could mesmerize observers for hours. Now those same spires were cracking and breaking apart under the relentless bombardment from the Korthok raiders, who circled it like vultures waiting for their prey to finally stop moving. The Korthok ships themselves were nightmares made real, massive black vessels covered in spikes and aggressive angles, designed to strike fear into anyone who saw them. Each ship was easily twice the size of the human vessels, their hulls gleaming with the kind of advanced armor plating that cost more than most planets' annual budgets. Plasma cannons protruded from every surface like the fangs of some cosmic predator, and their engines glowed with an ominous red light that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The lead Korthok commander's voice boomed across all communication frequencies, with the arrogant confidence of someone who had never encountered real resistance. His words dripped with contempt as he addressed the human fleet. Human vessels, you are outgunned and outnumbered. Your primitive ships stand no chance against our superior firepower. Withdraw now, and we will allow you to flee with your lives, or remain and be destroyed alongside these pathetic crystal breakers. Admiral Minho listened to the transmission with an expression that could have been carved from stone, but those who knew him could see the cold fury building behind his eyes. He had spent his entire career protecting the innocent and defending those who couldn't defend themselves, and the casual cruelty in the Korthok commander's voice triggered something primal in his response. His reply came without hesitation, broadcast on all frequencies, so that every ship in the system could hear. All ships. Attack pattern Delta. Target their engines first. I want them alive to see what happens when you threaten innocence. The battle began with the kind of violence that could only exist in the vacuum of space. Commander Sunho's heavy cruiser Soul's Hammer charged directly at the lead Korthok vessel. Its engines pushed to maximum power as plasma fire erupted from the raider ship like deadly fireworks. The human ship absorbed hit after hit, its reinforced hull glowing cherry red from the intense heat, but refusing to break. These were ships built by people who came from a world where volcanic eruptions and asteroid impacts were just Tuesday, and they showed it in every reinforced beam and redundant system. When the Soul's Hammer returned fire, the difference in philosophy became immediately apparent. While the Korthok had built their weapons for maximum intimidation, huge plasma cannons that created spectacular light shows, the humans had built their weapons for maximum effectiveness. Human railguns fired solid projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed, punching through the Korthok vessel's decorative armor plating like it was made of paper. The psychological impact was devastating, as the raiders realized their supposedly superior ships were being torn apart by what they had dismissed as primitive human technology. The first Korthok vessel began breaking apart within minutes of engaging the human fleet, but its destruction was only the beginning. Lieutenant Yunji and her Marines had launched their boarding pods the moment the battle began, using the chaos of the firefight to punch through the raider ship's hull and deposit human soldiers directly into the enemy vessel's corridors. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for generations. The Korthok raiders were used to fighting civilized opponents who followed predictable patterns and respected certain boundaries in combat. They had never encountered humans who treated space warfare like an extension of Earth's most brutal urban conflicts. Yunji's Marines used the ship's own artificial gravity systems against its crew, creating gravity wells that crushed enemies against bulkheads or left them floating helplessly as human soldiers. Closed in with weapons designed for close quarters combat, the raiders found their own corridors, turned into death traps as human soldiers used every dirty trick learned in the ruins of Earth's burned cities. They moved through the ship like ghosts, appearing from ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels, striking without warning, and disappearing before the confused raiders could mount a coordinated response. Within 20 minutes, the first Korthok vessel was completely under human control, its surviving crew members staring in shock at soldiers who had just redefined their understanding of what warfare could be. The remaining Korthok raiders quickly realized they were facing something completely outside their understanding of galactic warfare. What they had expected to be a quick intimidation of primitive humans had turned into a nightmare where every assumption about combat was being shattered. Captain Jinwoo's destroyer, Busan Lightning, demonstrated this in the most terrifying way possible, as it suddenly changed direction in a maneuver that violated everything the raiders thought they knew about physics and biology. The destroyer pulled a 15G turn that should have turned every living thing aboard into paste against the bulkheads. In galactic standard combat, even the most advanced species rarely exceeded 3Gs during combat maneuvers because their crews simply couldn't survive the crushing forces. But Jinwoo's crew had been born and raised on a world where gravity was already trying to kill them every day, and their ships were built with artificial gravity systems that could not only compensate for extreme maneuvers, but actually use those forces as weapons. As the Busan Lightning completed its impossible turn, it maintained perfect weapons lock on two Korthok vessels simultaneously. The raider captains watched in disbelief as their targeting computers struggled to track a ship that was moving in ways their programmers had never imagined possible. When the destroyer opened fire, its weapons struck with surgical precision, while the ship continued to dance through space in patterns that made veteran Korthok navigators dizzy. Pilot Sungmin was flying his fighter through the expanding debris field of the first destroyed raider ship, weaving between chunks of twisted metal and sparking electronics that would have shredded any normal vessel. His fighter was built to Earth's military specifications, which meant it could function in conditions that would destroy civilian craft. The hull was reinforced to survive impacts that would crush standard fighters, and his engines could operate in the electromagnetic interference that was now filling the combat zone. Using the Bison Lightning's enhanced sensor array, Sungmen was feeding targeting data directly to the other human ships, identifying weak points in Korthok armor and exploiting gaps in their defensive formations. The raiders were discovering that their ships, designed primarily for intimidation, had critical vulnerabilities that human tactical analysis could identify and exploit within minutes. The most shocking moment came when Engineering Officer Taeyeon made a decision that would have been unthinkable to any other galactic military force over the ship's internal communication system. His voice was calm and matter-of-fact as he announced, rerouting power from life support to forward weapons and shields, artificial gravity reducing to 20%, all excess power to defensive systems. His crew didn't panic or protest. They simply activated their emergency gear and continued fighting as their ship's atmosphere grew thinner and colder. These were people who had trained in environments that could kill unprotected humans in minutes, and they treated the reduced life support like a minor inconvenience. The extra power flowing to their weapons meant they could punch through Korthok shields that had seemed impenetrable moments before. The human ships began moving like a pack of wolves, each vessel coordinating with the others through quantum entanglement communicators that allowed them to share information instantly across vast distances. The Korthok fleet, which had seemed so organized and disciplined when attacking helpless researchers, was being systematically dismantled by opponents who shared targeting data and coordinated attacks with a precision that seemed almost telepathic. Navigator Yuna was plotting intercept courses that turned the raiders' numerical advantage against them, instead of allowing the Korthok ships to use their superior firepower to overwhelm individual human vessels. She was positioning the human fleet so that fleeing raiders found themselves trapped between multiple human ships with no escape routes. Every time a Korthok captain tried to withdraw from combat to regroup, they discovered that human ships were already waiting for them. Gunner Changman had stopped targeting the raiders' weapons or command centers, and was instead focusing exclusively on their engine systems. His shots were calculated not to destroy the enemy ships quickly, but to cripple them and ensure they couldn't escape. The message being sent was clear and terrifying. These humans weren't just defending the research station, they were making sure that every single raider in the system would pay for threatening innocent civilians. What had begun as a rescue mission was rapidly becoming something far more ominous, a systematic hunt, where human patience and tactical superiority were being used to ensure that not one raider would survive to terrorize another colony. The Korthak were learning that when humans said they protected the innocent, they meant it with a finality that other galactic species had never demonstrated. While the space battle raged outside, Marine Captain Jaeon and his boarding teams were facing an entirely different kind of warfare inside the crippled Zealothi research station. The moment their transport pods punched through the station's damaged hull, they knew they were entering a disaster zone unlike anything most galactic species had ever encountered. The air itself was toxic, filled with chemical compounds that would have killed most life forms within minutes. But the human Marines moved through it like they were walking through a slightly unpleasant fog. The Zealothi research station had once been a marvel of crystalline architecture, with corridors that sparkled like the inside of a geode, and laboratories that refracted light in patterns that could inspire awe in any observer. Now those same beautiful structures were cracked and failing, with emergency lighting casting eerie shadows through the fractured crystal walls. The worst part was the sound, a constant, haunting chime as the crystalline structures resonated with the vibrations from the ongoing bombardment, creating a melody that sounded like a funeral dirge. Manek Dayun was the first to realize that the Zealothi weren't just dying from the direct damage caused by the Korthok attack. Her medical scanner showed readings that made her blood run cold. The station's failing life support systems were actually poisoning the very people they were supposed to protect. The atmospheric processors, damaged by the bombardment, were producing trace compounds that were slowly killing every Zealothi on the station through chemical poisoning. "This is impossible," she muttered as she ran diagnostics on the station's systems. Standard galactic emergency protocols call for increasing oxygen flow and reducing atmospheric pressure in emergency situations. But that's exactly what's killing them. The Zealothi had evolved on a world with a completely different atmospheric composition, and what other species considered life-saving emergency measures were actually accelerating their death. Daehun's training kicked in, but not her medical training. Her experience growing up in Earth's industrial zones where atmospheric contamination was a daily reality. She began ripping apart the station's filtration systems and rebuilding them, using principles learned from Earth's mining operations, where workers regularly dealt with atmospheres that would be instantly lethal to unprotected humans. The filters she was installing would have been considered primitive and dangerous by galactic standards, but they were exactly what the Zealoty needed to survive. Technical specialist Woojin was working alongside her, jury-rigging life support systems using equipment that would have horrified any galactic safety inspector. He was connecting industrial air scrubbers directly to the station's main atmospheric system, bypassing safety protocols that existed to protect other species, but were slowly poisoning the Zealoty. His team was working in radiation levels that were off the charts. The station's damaged reactor was leaking energy that would have been lethal to most galactic races within hours. Radiation levels are approaching critical, one of his technicians reported, but Woojin just nodded and kept working. Their enhanced protection suits were built to Earth military specifications, designed to function in environments that other species couldn't even imagine surviving. The suits were bulky and uncomfortable, but they could protect human soldiers in conditions that would instantly kill unprotected organic life. Throughout the station, the rescued Zealoty watched in complete amazement as the human rescue teams moved through their toxic, irradiated environment like it was just another day at the office. The crystalline beings had never seen anything like it. These humans were breathing air that should have dissolved their lungs, working in radiation that should have cooked them alive, and handling chemicals that should have burned through their protective equipment. Researcher Primatel, one of the station's senior scientists, whispered to her colleague in their musical crystalline language, "They treat poison like we treat morning mist. How is this possible?" She had spent her entire career studying different forms of life throughout the galaxy, but humans were completely outside her understanding of what biological life should be capable of surviving. Sergeant Minyuk was coordinating the actual evacuation, and he was discovering that rescuing Zealoty presented unique challenges that no military manual had ever covered. The crystalline beings weighed almost nothing in Earth standard gravity. Each individual was lighter than a human child, but they were incredibly fragile. Their bodies were essentially living crystal structures that could shatter if handled roughly, and each one required careful support to prevent fractures during transport. During the hyperspace jump to reach the station, each Marine in his squad had been studying Zealoty physiology, using data provided by galactic medical databases. They had transformed themselves from combat soldiers into impromptu paramedics, learning how to handle beings whose bodies were so different from human anatomy that standard first aid procedures could be fatal. Now they were putting that crash course education to use, carrying crystalline researchers with the same careful precision they would use to transport priceless artifacts, while explosions continued to rock the station around them. The Korthok fleet commander watched his tactical display with growing disbelief as more of his ships fell to the human attackers. These primitive Deathworlders were supposed to be easy prey, overwhelmed by superior Korthok technology and numbers. In desperation, he activated his emergency beacon and called for every available raider squadron in the sector. His message was broadcast on all Korthok frequencies. "All vessels, converge on my position immediately. We have encountered unexpected resistance. Bring everything you have." Within minutes, the space around the Zealoty research station became crowded with new arrivals. 3 additional raider squadrons materialized out of hyperspace, their massive black holes bristling with weapons as they took up attack formations. The Korthok commander felt his confidence returning as he counted the new ships. Over 30 vessels now surrounded the small human fleet. Even these surprisingly resilient humans couldn't possibly stand against such overwhelming numbers. But Admiral Minho's reaction to the arriving reinforcements was not what anyone expected. Instead of ordering a tactical withdrawal or calling for his own backup, he actually smiled. It was the cold, predatory smile of someone who had just seen their prey walk directly into a carefully prepared trap. His voice carried across all human communication channels with deadly calm, signaled a fleet hunting pattern, Omega. Time to show them what pack tactics really mean. What happened next would be studied in military academies throughout human space for generations to come. The arrival of Korthok reinforcements didn't overwhelm the human fleet. It revealed the true nature of human space combat doctrine. Commander Sunho's heavy cruiser Soul's Hammer suddenly wasn't fighting as an individual ship anymore. It had become the apex predator in a perfectly coordinated pack, with every other human vessel moving in flawless synchronization to support and amplify its effectiveness. The human ships began moving in patterns that seemed to defy everything the Korthok thought they knew about space warfare. Each vessel occupied a precise position in three-dimensional space, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the entire combat zone into a killing ground, where no enemy ship could move without being targeted by multiple human weapons simultaneously. The raiders found themselves trapped in a web of crossfire, where every attempt to engage one human ship exposed them to devastating attacks from the others. Lieutenant Colonel Hyunjin was coordinating marine boarding actions across multiple enemy ships at the same time, his forces moving through Korthok vessels like an immune system attacking a virus. His boarding teams had developed tactics that treated enemy ships not as individual targets, but as connected parts of a larger organism that needed to be systematically neutralized. Marines would board one ship, secure critical systems, then use that vessel's own docking bays and communications to coordinate attacks on neighboring ships. The boarding teams moved through Korthok corridors with an efficiency that terrified the raiders. These weren't random acts of violence. They were surgical strikes carried out by soldiers who had learned warfare on a planet where every day was a battle for survival. Human tactics reflected lessons learned in Earth's most hostile environments. From the frozen wastelands of Antarctica to the burning deserts of Africa, all adapted for the three-dimensional battlefield of space combat. Fighter Squadron Leader Geo was demonstrating the true genius of human tactical thinking as she led her pilots in attack runs that turned the raiders' own formations against them, instead of trying to match the Korthok ships 1-for-1. Her fighters were using hit-and-run tactics that forced damaged enemy vessels to collide with their own reinforcements. She would target the engines of ships positioned on the outside of Korthok formations, sending them spinning helplessly into their neighbors and creating chain reactions of destruction that rippled through entire squadrons. The Korthok raiders were slowly realizing that they weren't fighting a desperate rescue mission carried out by noble but doomed humans. They were being systematically hunted by creatures whose entire evolutionary history had prepared them for exactly this kind of warfare. Every human tactic reflected millions of years of surviving on a world that had tried to kill them through ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and countless other disasters that had taught humanity one fundamental lesson. When faced with overwhelming odds, you don't just fight to survive, you fight to make sure your enemy never threatens anyone again. As more Korthok ships fell to human attacks, their surviving crews began to understand that they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had expected to face civilians, or at worst, some kind of galactic peacekeeping force. Instead, they had encountered the military representatives of a species that treated warfare as just another survival skill, practiced on a daily basis, in an environment that most galactic species considered uninhabitable. The Korthok fleet was bleeding ships faster than their commander had ever seen in decades of raiding across the galaxy. What had started as a routine attack on helpless researchers had turned into a massacre, with human forces systematically dismantling his fleet, using tactics that seemed to come from the nightmares of military strategists. His flagship was taking heavy damage, his communications array was failing, and more than half of his vessels were either destroyed or crippled beyond repair. In desperation, the Korthok commander opened an emergency channel directly to the human flagship, hoping that These strange Deathworlders might be willing to listen to reason. His voice, which had been filled with arrogant confidence just hours earlier, now carried the unmistakable tremor of fear as he broadcast his plea. Human leader, we acknowledge your superior tactics and fighting capability. We offer immediate withdrawal from this system in exchange for safe passage for our remaining vessels. This conflict serves neither of us. We have learned our lesson and will not threaten this region again. The response from Admiral Minho came without hesitation, broadcast not just to the Korthok fleet, but across all frequencies where it could be heard, by both fleets and even the Galactic Communications Hub, monitoring the battle from thousands of light-years away. His voice was calm and measured, carrying the weight of absolute moral certainty. You came to this system to prey on innocent beings who had no way to defend themselves. You attacked researchers and their families for profit and pleasure. We came here to stop you from committing that atrocity. Only one of us is leaving this system alive. Communications Officer Hune watched his displays as the Korthok fleet immediately began trying to scatter in all directions, their formation dissolving as individual ships broke away and attempted to reach the edge of the system where they could jump to hyperspace. But as he tracked their movement patterns, he realized something that made his blood run cold. The humans had been expecting exactly this response. Captain Gina's tactical planning had been flawless from the very beginning. She had positioned human ships not just for maximum combat effectiveness during the main battle, but to cover every possible escape vector from the system. The Korthok raiders were discovering that no matter which direction they fled, human vessels were already waiting for them with weapons powered and targeting systems locked on. The systematic elimination of the remaining raider ships began immediately, but it wasn't carried out with the chaotic violence of a typical space battle. Instead, it was executed with the methodical precision of professional exterminators dealing with dangerous pests. Commander Yunho had been given specific orders to prioritize the command vessels and communication ships, ensuring that no leader would escape to threaten other colonies or report human tactical capabilities to other pirate fleets. Weapons Officer Seojin was demonstrating the difference between humans' military doctrine and the approach used by most galactic species. Instead of simply blowing enemy ships apart as quickly as possible, he was targeting engines and life support systems with surgical precision. This gave the Korthok crews time to understand exactly what was happening to them. They had minutes, or sometimes hours, to contemplate their fate before their ships finally succumbed to the systematic destruction of every critical system. The humans weren't fighting with the blind rage that most species expected from creatures they considered barely civilized. Instead, they were demonstrating the cold, calculating efficiency of natural predators protecting their territory. Every shot was measured, every tactic was deliberate, and every decision was made with the long-term goal of ensuring that this particular group of raiders would never threaten innocent civilians again. As the battle reached its conclusion, the scope of the human victory became clear to observers throughout the galaxy. 37 Korthok vessels had been reduced to expanding clouds of metallic debris and frozen atmosphere, their crews learning far too late that humanity's reputation as Deathworlders wasn't just about their ability to survive on planets that would kill most other species. The real lesson that the galaxy was learning was much more terrifying. Those harsh worlds had taught humanity everything they needed to know about warfare. They had learned to fight, not just for survival, but for the complete elimination of threats to their pack. When humans said they would protect the innocent, they meant it with a finality that other galactic species had never demonstrated. The Korthok raiders had made the fatal mistake of assuming that human mercy was the same as human weakness, and now they were paying the ultimate price for that. Miscalculation with the last of the Korthok raiders, reduced to drifting scrap metal. The human fleet found themselves facing what would prove to be their most difficult challenge yet. The space battle had been brutal, but straightforward: identify the enemy and eliminate them. Now they had to keep 847 rescued Zelathi alive, during a 6-day journey to the nearest Galactic Council station. And these crystalline beings had biological needs that human warships had never been designed to accommodate. Chief Engineer Q stood in what had been Cargo Base 7 just hours earlier, now frantically trying to transform it into something that could sustain alien life. The Zealothi needed very specific atmospheric conditions to survive, precise mixtures of gases, exact humidity levels, and lighting that fell within extremely narrow spectral ranges. His engineering teams were essentially rebuilding entire sections of the ship while in flight, using whatever materials they could scavenge from other systems. We need to increase the argon concentration by exactly 3%. He called out to his team as they worked with industrial atmospheric processors that had been ripped from the ship's mining equipment storage. Any more, and their respiratory systems start to crystallize. Any less, and they begin to suffocate. His hands were already raw from handling equipment that wasn't meant for this kind of precision work. But failure wasn't an option. The most dangerous part of the operation fell to volunteers like reactor technician Minsiok, who had to manually maintain the life support systems in radiation-flooded sections of the ship. The power requirements for keeping the Zealothi alive meant running the ship's reactor at dangerous levels, and the automated systems couldn't handle the constant adjustments needed. Minsiok and his team were taking shifts in areas where the radiation exposure would eventually prove lethal. But they accepted this risk because the alternative was watching their rescued civilians die. Radiation levels are approaching critical in Section C, Minsiok reported over the communication system, his voice steady, despite the fact that his dosimeter was screaming warnings at him. I can give you another 4 hours before I have to rotate out. He was already showing early signs of radiation sickness, but he refused to leave his post until a replacement was ready. Medical officer Solman had transformed the ship's medical bay into something that looked more like a disaster relief center than a military hospital. She was treating human crew members who were suffering from various forms of environmental exposure, chemical burns from handling alien atmospheric mixtures, radiation sickness from maintaining the life support systems, and exhaustion from working around the clock in conditions that were slowly poisoning them at the same time. She was caring for Zealothi who were suffering from trauma-induced crystalline fractures, a condition that occurred when their species experienced extreme stress or fear. Their bodies would literally begin to crack like damaged glass, requiring treatments that no human medical training had ever covered. She was learning Zealothi physiology through trial and error, using medical databases and her own intuition to develop treatments that wouldn't kill her patients. Supply Officer Young was performing calculations that would determine whether everyone aboard the ship would survive the journey. The Zealothi didn't eat food in the way humans understood it. Instead, they absorbed nutrients directly through their crystalline skin from their atmospheric environment. This meant he had to constantly adjust the chemical composition of their habitat chambers while also rationing traditional food and water for the human crew. We're looking at 6 days to reach Proxima Station, he reported to Admiral Minho during the daily briefing. I can stretch our supplies to cover the crew, but only if we reduce rations by 20%. The bigger problem is maintaining the nutrient levels in the Zealothi chambers. We're having to use industrial chemicals that weren't meant for biological systems. Navigator Yuna was plotting their course with the knowledge that a fleet of human warships carrying alien civilians would attract unwanted attention from species that still viewed humanity with suspicion and fear. She had to find the most direct route to safety, while avoiding patrol routes where other galactic military forces might intercept them and demand explanations for what they were doing. Maintenance Chief Hansel was leading repair crews that worked in continuous shifts, knowing that any failure in their improvised life support systems would result in the death of hundreds of innocent beings. His teams treated every mechanical problem not as a routine maintenance issue, but as a potential catastrophe that could undo everything they had sacrificed to achieve. They worked with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that 8 lives depended on their ability to keep jury-rigged systems functioning far beyond their design specifications. 6 days after the battle that had shaken the foundations of galactic military thinking, the human fleet finally approached Proxima Station with their precious cargo of survivors. Admiral Minho stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching as the massive space station grew larger on their main viewer. Proxima Station was one of the galaxy's major diplomatic and commercial hubs, a gleaming structure that housed representatives from dozens of different species and served as a symbol of galactic civilization. The docking procedures that followed were unlike anything the station had ever experienced. Normally, refugee ships arrived as broken, desperate vessels carrying traumatized survivors who required immediate medical attention and psychological support. But as the human fleet approached, station sensors revealed something that contradicted everything the galactic community thought they knew about rescue operations. All 847 Zealothi survivors were not just alive, they were in stable, healthy condition. The crystalline beings were being housed in precisely controlled environmental chambers that maintained their atmospheric needs with a precision that exceeded most dedicated medical facilities. Station medical scanners detected no signs of malnutrition, atmospheric poisoning, or the psychological trauma that typically affected disaster survivors. Station Commander Veltar, an elderly Altarian diplomat who had spent his entire career dealing with galactic crises, personally came to the docking bay to meet Admiral Minho. His attitude was completely different from the dismissive reports that had flooded galactic communication channels just days earlier, when most species had written off the human rescue mission as a noble but doomed gesture. Admiral Minho, Veltar said, his multiple arms gesturing in the traditional Altarian greeting of respect. The Galactic Council has asked me to formally acknowledge your fleet's unprecedented success. We had prepared our medical facilities for a humanitarian disaster, but instead, we find ourselves witnessing what may be the most successful rescue operation in galactic history. As news of the rescue spread across the galaxy's communication networks, the story reached every inhabited system within hours. Species that had previously dismissed humanity as dangerous primitives, barely worthy of galactic recognition, suddenly found themselves forced to completely reevaluate their assumptions. The humans hadn't just succeeded in their impossible mission, they had accomplished it with a level of competence that put the galaxy's most advanced civilizations to shame. The most significant moment came when research leader Primit, while speaking for all the Zealothi survivors, formally requested that humanity assume responsibility for their protection in a press conference broadcast throughout galactic space. Her crystalline voice carried absolute conviction as she explained her people's decision. When our distress call went out, when our lives hung in the balance, every major galactic power turned away from us. They declared our rescue impossible, our situation hopeless. Only the humans came. They fought when others declared it impossible. They saved us when the galaxy had abandoned us to die. This marked the first time in galactic history that an established species had voluntarily sought alliance with humanity. The Zealothi weren't being conquered or intimidated into joining human space. They were actively choosing to place their trust in the beings that other species still called Deathworlders. Captain Sunho was completing his final combat report in his quarters, documenting details that would be studied by military strategists for generations. The numbers told a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. The engagement had cost them 3 Marines with minor wounds and significant equipment damage from pushing their ships beyond normal operational limits, but they had achieved 0 fatalities among either crew or refugees. Their casualty rate was actually lower than what most galactic naval forces experienced. During routine training exercises, Admiral Minho sat alone in his ready room, composing the log entry that would become one of the most quoted documents in human military history. His words would eventually become required reading at naval academies throughout human space. Today we learned something important about our place in the galaxy. Sometimes the most dangerous predators make the most reliable protectors, not because we enjoy violence, but because we understand what true strength really means. True strength means standing between the innocent and those who would harm them, regardless of the cost to ourselves. He paused, looking out at the stars that surrounded Proxima Station, thinking about humanity's future among the galactic community. The universe is full of sheep, wolves, and sheepdogs. The sheep are the innocent civilians who just want to live their lives in peace. The wolves are the predators who prey upon the innocent for their own gain. And the sheepdogs are those who have the strength to fight the wolves, but choose to use that strength to protect the sheep instead. Today, humanity chose which one we want to be.